Good evening. Hi, I tried to give this live earlier, but no success. I had the boys in grumpy moods. Eamon kept trying to take my temperature in weird and wonderful ways, and Tintin, I think, is just freaking out because he's starting to walk and doesn't want to. I don't know. He just wants cuddles all the time. So anyway, that was why this morning didn't work, but I wanted to give this paper because there was a lot of interest the other night when I was talking about the hangings at Higaturu that happened during World War II in Papua New Guinea. And I thought I would just give the paper that Jonathan Ritchie and I wrote many years ago now. I think we originally wrote this for the Brothers and Sisters conference that Noah Reisman held at the Australian Catholic University, but it could also have been one that we gave for something else as well. We've been working on this project since 2014, so it's been a while, and there's been a lot of spin-offs and bits and pieces that have come out of it. So this is just one part of it. So I'll just give the paper, and then if anyone has any questions or you want me to follow up on anything, just let me know. I was going to go to sleep, but then I thought I really want to do this before I do that. So the presentation concerns events that took place in Papua New Guinea's northern province from July 1942 to July 1943. It was in this region at Guinea where the Japanese forces landed in July of 1942. They attempted to cross the Owen Stanley Range to reach Port Moresby via the overland route in what became known as the Kokoda Campaign. Hey, Saf, this is that story I was trying to tell the other morning and in much more detail. So unsuccessful, by the end of 1942, they were being forced back along the track to Guinea, and while the fighting continued until the Allied victories at Buna, Sanananda and Guinea itself, the Australian administration was well inside the territory again by late January 1943. The Australian administration scrambled to assess the damage that had been caused by the 6 months of fighting in the area and to reinstate a system of law and order. The events that inspired this paper took place during the period of chaos, danger and instability from August 1942, after the Australian administration had been forced to depart until its return early the next year. Out of the disorder emerges an instance of deadly clarity and decisiveness when one morning in July 1943, in a clearing about a quarter of a mile from the small settlement of Higaturu, an act of retribution conducted before an audience of thousands of Papuans. The presentation is entitled The Death and Life of Embogi. In it, I'll discuss in no particular order who Embogi was, what he did, what happened to him, and how he ended up branded a war criminal. We, the research team, which has included, been led primarily by Dr. Jonathan Ritchie with Dr. Andrew Motu and Greg Bablis and a bunch of other people. Hey, Owen. So we're deeply indebted to McLaren Hiari, who's one of the main Papua New Guinean historians who works around Kokoda that we have collaborated with. He occupies a unique position in the historiography of World War II in Papua New Guinea. McLaren lives in Popondetta in Papua New Guinea's northern province, and he's amassed a remarkable body of material documenting the Papua New Guinean experience of war. Over the past couple of years, Jonathan has been privileged to work alongside him during field work in Papua New Guinea, and I know Victoria Stead has as well. And McLaren has contributed a very valuable paper which bears directly on the subject matter of today's presentation. So we wanted to acknowledge him. Hey, Alicia. Okay, so we had a little bit of work to do tracking Embogi and what he was up to. So his name is one that is associated with lots of different things. So the first time Jonathan had heard his name was from an old man sitting inside his darkened living room in Sydney. Jonathan had done an interview with him for the National Library of Australia. It was David Marsh. And he was one of those intrepid young Australians who sought to build their lives in Australia's territory of Papua in the years before the war erupted. He was 19 in 1940, and he'd been working for someone named Bert Kienzle, who was supervising the labour lines at Kienzle's gold mine at Yoda, which was near the government station at Kokoda. With the Japanese invasion in July 1942, Kienzle and Marsh managed the highly complex job of recruiting and overseeing the work of the famous Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels during the Kokoda campaign. So a lot of people who'd been working on labour lines on the mines ended up as carriers on the track or trail, whichever way you want to describe. Later in the war, Marsh saw service in many parts of Papua and New Guinea as an officer with ANGA, the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit, and then became a patrol officer, eventually reaching the lofty position of District Commissioner. 87, at the time of his interview with Jonathan, Marsh had a phenomenal recollection of the war, even though it was about 7 decades before. In November 1942, Marsh was amongst the first Australian administrators to re-enter the interior of Papua New Guinea, following closely on the heels of the returning Australian troops. The fighting was still nearby, with Japanese troops still being pushed back along the Kokoda Trail to Gona and the northern beaches. Marsh was given the job of overseer again, this time for the workers getting the airstrip at Popondetta back to a usable state for Allied aircraft, a challenging task with all the fighting still going on only a few miles away. Who should he find when camping for the night at the abandoned mission station at Sangara but Embogi, sitting alone, 30 feet above the ground in a treehouse, surrounded by what Marsh recognised as hundreds of items stolen from the small pre-war Australian population. The two of them spent a cold and wet night at Sangara and talked. During the course of the night, he found out something of Embogi's life. This man was charismatic, he said. He was a wonderful man. The following day, Embogi had gathered a large group of men who, together with them, repaired the runway that subsequently allowed the planes to land to bring in supplies and evacuate the wounded. During a break in the recording, to my consternation, and this is Jonathan who was writing this, Marsh started to cry. And he was crying about Embogi, and in particular about what the army did to this wonderful, charismatic man. On a July morning in 1943, he was hanged at Higaturu. He was executed for a series of crimes he allegedly committed with others who he influenced during the Japanese campaign. In particular, he was hanged for his betrayal and murder of between 8 to 10 people, including Europeans and Papua New Guinean people, and especially including the Anglican missionaries Mavis Hayman and May Parkinson in August of 1942. So this is the height of the fighting. Despite Embogi freely admitting his misdeeds, 70 years later, Marsh remained haunted by what he still regarded as the injustice of the Papuans' fate. In Marsh's eyes, the crimes this wonderful charismatic man and his followers perpetrated in 1942 were committed at a time of confusion, when the old loyalty to Australia and the church was being replaced by a new loyalty to Japan. He suggested that there was even a kind of pre-micro-nationalism in Embogi's actions, where the chains of servitude were being thrown off. So what was going on? Embogi's story could lend him to depictions either as a terrorist or a freedom fighter. Though not a simple role to define or classify, or character to reconstruct, we can understand much about Australia's colonial relationships in Papua and New Guinea through this story. So David Marsh was not the only one profoundly affected by Embogi's execution and that of the 4 others who were hanged on the same day. This paper that we wrote concentrates on 2 accounts from people who witnessed the events at Higaturu and who took active parts in the executions. The first was Thomas Grahamslaw, who was the district officer for the local Mambari district. He presided over the event and left a detailed description of both it and the events that led to it. His account has been on the record for some time. The other account was made available in 2014 when Jonathan Ritchie and a team of Papua New Guinean historians and heritage workers conducted interviews in Popondetta. This account was provided by the daughter of the late Redmond Menuda. He passed away in April of 2014, but he had left a detailed account of the hangings to his daughter, who passed it on to us. Mr. Menuda was a medical orderly. He worked in support of the Australian troops during the Kokoda and subsequent battles, and in July 1943 he was ordered to assist with the hangings. Other recollections can be found of this as well, but the execution of Papuans in July 1943, as well as more that took place in 1944, remains a lacuna in the Australian and Papua New Guinean historical record of the war. It's been easier to forget it than to remember it. And as has so often been the case with wartime memories, that's just how it goes. There have been moments in the past where this history has surfaced and accusations made against the Australians involved that they were actively trying to cover it up. And I posted a newspaper article that kind of referred to that discussion as well, particularly because this is pretty much a cross against the Australian colonial system. I've also posted up a poster that our colleague Dr. Victoria Stead had spotted in a Lygon Street restaurant. So it seems to relate to the ultimately futile efforts by the former Member of Parliament, Dr. Barry Jones, who was a strong advocate against the death penalty in Australia during the 1960s, to track down the trial records of Embogi and the others who were put to death in the war. So he was speaking out about this in 1978, and he claimed that the documents remained missing and that this was a deplorable thing and a mark against the Parliament. The Papuans, he said, and this is a quote, were hanged at Higaturu after trials of unknown length, held in unknown conditions, before a tribunal with unknown qualifications, with unknown translation facilities, in which the accused may or may not have been represented by counsel. It may be that the records, if found, would prove Embogi to have been a major war criminal ranking with the major Nazis, but we do not have any records at all. So we did find some records through the National Archives that reveal something of the trials that took place, but they're scant and reflect the chaotic aftermath of battles along the track, and also the determination of those in authority to send a clear message that treason would not be tolerated. What the material from the National Archives reveals is that no word of the executions reached the Minister for the External Territories until April 1945. And this information had been provided by missionaries associated with the Board of Missions in Australia, who had heard that 28 Papua New Guineans had been hanged for treason. So there was a considerable amount of misinformation and inaccurate detail circulating through the various channels of communication. Hank Nelson, who has written a lot of Papua New Guinean history and is one of the key contributors, he wrote about the smoke screens created to prevent the knowledge spreading even to the Minister for External Territories, and the deliberate fudging of the lines of responsibility between civilian and military administrations. The subsequent report, written well after the fact, lists the men accused and the charges laid against them. Trials were held between March and June of 1943. On the 9th of October 1943, the headquarters of the HGF required Angau officers to forward the original depositions to the treason cases as to Sir William Webb, the Atrocities Commissioner. It was assumed that the headquarters of the NGF sent the documents to the Commissioner, but they were reportedly never returned to the headquarters, and that was the point where they were believed to have disappeared. So that's the story. The summary report forwarded to headquarters offers some information about the trials. These documents claim that Embogi was guilty of turning Lieutenant Smith over to the Japanese. The details were included in this report. So Smith had come to Embogi's village, Hohombota. 2 Papua New Guineans found him, Diparembo and Biari, and took him at gunpoint to Embogi. There he stayed for 2 or 3 days before Embogi took him to another man, Uruje. Uruje handcuffed Smith, and from there they went to Lower Doboduru and on to Buna, where they gave Smith to the Japanese. There were several collaborators in this event, but it was only Embogi who took the brunt of the punishment for this particular crime. Diparembo was later convicted of rape, but received a sentence of 5 years hard labour rather than the death sentence. Taking up responsibility for disciplining the offenders, both Grahamslaw and Menuda were clearly disturbed by what took place in the following decades. Grahamslaw wrote that it was a grim experience which I shall never forget. On the night of the executions, he said he lay awake most of the night listening to the drums beating and the wailing of the mourners in the village adjacent to Higaturu and reliving the events of the day. and he also wrote later that he had seen death in various forms during the preceding 12 months, but nothing affected me, this is his quote, as deeply as the hangings of Embogi and his fellow murderers. Perhaps it was the courage they displayed when the time came for them to die. Manuda too told his daughter that the executions are a grim experience which I will never forget. It will remain with me until I die. He described how he was one of many policemen, medical orderlies, ANGAR officers and thousands of village people who witnessed these ugly and horrifying events. Speaking of Graham's Law, Redmond Manuda explained that he was a good and kind officer who always had a good relationship with the local people, and the people liked him so much. The people accepted that Major Graham's Law was carrying out his duties as ordered by the Australian Army, but we felt sorry for the dead Wontoks. The hangman was the Royal Papuan Constabulary's Ron Hicks, who appeared in a hurry to get on with it. So yeah, that's a little bit about the gallows and stuff, which I don't think I really want to go into on Facebook Live at this time of night. Yeah, so they were executed in front of this huge audience of people from the surrounding areas as a bit of an example, in other words. The people Manuda recalled were so disturbed that they stopped assisting the Australian Army by reporting people who collaborated with the Japanese. Before stepping off the branch, Embogi gave a speech that left a great impression on the assembled crowd, Australian and Papua New Guinean alike. Graham's Law remembered Embogi's sonorous voice. Redmond Manuda recalled, no, Saf, no, I don't think so. I think there might have been a small snippet of this on 60 Minutes or something similar, but no documentaries that I know of. Redmond Manuda recalled that Embogi confessed his sins and told the people that the government was right in hanging him. He also told the people of him not becoming a Christian and appealed to his people to ask the Anglican mission to move the work of God. Some years ago, McLaren Hiari interviewed another eyewitness, a medical officer, Harry Bitmead, who was able to record more or less word for word his speech. Among the words that Bitmead remembered was this confession. I have taught the wrong things to you because I thought the white men were tricking us. I did these wrong things because I was also angry with the white men and the government for mistreating our people and jailing them for minor offences. But now before I die, I, your leader, command you to go to the mission. The government is right in punishing me today. I'm not angry with the government, the mission and the white men. I'm also not angry with the Papuan policemen and the Papuan people. I'm not afraid of this punishment. I accept this punishment. After Embogi finished his speech, Graham's Law told him, you are now standing on a bad spot. Please step forward and receive your reward from our king before your people. That was the end of that. I've got a lot more information here, including about the mission sisters who had been killed, Mavis Parkinson and May Heyman. In the Australian War Memorial, there's the final letter that one of them wrote, and I've got copies of that too, which might be of interest to people because she wrote it when they were hiding out in a cave before they got handed over. It's quite sad, obviously. And there's also one of the mission workers who was killed was a Papuan named Lucian Tapietti, and he is now he's been commemorated in a statue in Westminster Abbey. So there's a lot of unravelling to do in this whole story. What else can I say that is quick? Just bear with me for a minute. It's hard to condense an academic paper, especially when there was one conference that I presented at where I had to be timekeeper for Jonathan, and yes, he was very frustrated because he was going over and I was very ruthless. Anyway, so our conclusion on this paper was that a very brief discussion is necessary to try and begin to place Embogi his death and his life into some kind of historical context and to attempt a preliminary assessment about how we should regard him. He was an exceptional person in that not all Orokiva, his community, responded to the breakdown in order in the same way as Embogi and his followers. In fact, we revere other Orokiva men as the archetype Fuzzy Wuzzy Angel, Raphael Orembari, whose image has been used so often by the Australian media as an example of the typical efforts of Papua New Guineans who helped escort Australian walking wounded away from the fighting at Buna on Christmas Day in 1942. That was immortalised in the famous George Silk photograph, which a lot of you will recognise if I showed you. I might post that up later too so you can see. A contemporary Australian newspaper report was probably reasonably accurate concerning the behaviour of most Orokivans. It said, in Papua, between Buna, Gona and Kokoda is a numerically important tribe of Orokiva, formerly very truculent people who would not, it is credited, lend themselves willingly to any form of foreign coercion. From time to time, probably thousands of the men have served in the native armed constabulary, and it can hardly be supposed that they would help the invaders or be induced to take up arms against the government. It is significant from reports which are coming to hand that along the road to Kokoda and in the Owen Stanley Range, the enemy is using Japanese coolies. This is from the time. This would also almost imply that the Orokiva, for the most part, have deserted their villages along the main road and gone into the hills for the time being, distrustful of the Japanese, whose like possibly not one of them has ever seen. In fact, McLaren Hiari has recorded that thousands of Orokivans gave years of dedicated service to the Allied war effort as carriers, cooks, laundrymen and women, and fighters in the Papuan Infantry Battalion, where their skills caused the enemy to fear them greatly. This is also evident in the interviews that we, the collective team, did along the Kokoda track in 2014. So despite the Orokiva's fierce reputation, it's difficult to describe or to ascribe Embogi's crimes to his ethnic or tribal affiliation. It just doesn't work. So Jonathan and I at the time when we were writing this were saying that Embogi's path to Higaturu was due probably not only to his growing up in a time of great change, but also to his sense of marginalisation, which is exacerbated by the decades spent in a prison in Port Moresby. Much has been made in the various accounts of his execution, of his last-minute embracing of Christianity, and we love a story of redemption, especially when it's uttered in a powerful speech by a man in the gallows. But in the final analysis, we thought Embogi's life amidst the intrusion of colonialism, Christianity and war was his own to direct. The path he chose was one of many that were open to him, clearly a man of intelligence and character. The end of his life was abrupt and marked by tragedy, both for those whose deaths he brought about and eventually his own. So that's where we got up to. We were hoping to turn this into a longer paper for publication, but Saf, the idea of a documentary is a good one. Yeah, like I said, I think that it might have been covered for Lateline or one of those types of programs at some stage, but there's a lot of material that could be talked about in documentaries for Pacific history. Oh my goodness, where would you even start? There's a lot of really amazing stories. This is just one of them that we stumbled across. So yeah, I hope that has been of interest to people, and it's nice to be able to talk without interruption, that's for sure. Bless the little people. But yes, if there's more you want to hear, I will be happy to share, and I haven't even started talking about the biography that I've been working on, so maybe that can be another evening's work where I run through that. Yes, but have a nice night, and I'll be in touch soon. Bye.